Thank you for joining us for the East Mediterranean Business Cultures Alliances, the Legacy of the Treaty of Lausanne on its 100th anniversary panel discussion. My name is Luke Katzos, EMBCA's president, and I will be moderating today's panel. Our distinguished panel includes author and independent historical researcher Stavridis, author and independent scholar Nikos Nikoloudis, attorney John Papaspanos, and educator, community leader, entrepreneur Peter Stavrianidis. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed on July 24th, 1923, played a pivotal role in reshaping the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. This treaty marked the end of hostilities between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire and formally concluded World War I in the region. While it addressed numerous issues, its legacy continues to influence contemporary relations between Greece and Turkey, two key signatories. The treaty aimed to establish peaceful relations between Greece and Turkey, marking the end of hostilities after World War I, and the so-called incorrectly, in my opinion, Greco-Turkish War from 1919-1922. However, over the years, several contentious issues have strained and continue to strain their relationship. The Treaty of Lausanne is a historical document of great significance. It not only recognized the Republic of Turkey as the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, but also delineated its borders and its centuries of imperial rule. One of its central provisions, the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, led to the mass displacement of over 1.5 million people, fundamentally altering the demographic makeup of both nations. This exchange, while aimed per some to resolve ethnic tensions, left a legacy of unresolved issues, including the Christian genocide in the late Ottoman period, addressed in the earlier Treaty of Sevres, and grievances over the affected populations. Although the Treaty of Lausanne is very clear, there continue to be enduring territorial disputes in the Aegean Sea, resulting in ongoing disputes over sovereignty and resource exploration between Greece and Turkey. With Turkey laying claim to certain islands, inlets, and the continental shelf, leading to frequent tensions, naval standoffs, and massive airspace violations. This issue continues to remain a flashpoint up to this day, obviously, and continuing to their bilateral relations. Moreover, the issue of Cyprus continues to haunt the relationship between the two nations, leading to a complex and protracted conflict. The Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974 further strained relations, with the island remaining divided into the Republic of Cyprus in the south and the self-declared and not recognized, except for Turkey, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the north. This unresolved issue continues to hinder regional stability in the East Mediterranean. Another contentious legacy of the treaty is the protection of minority rights. While the treaty guaranteed the rights of the Hellenic minority in Turkey and the Turkish minority in the Hellenic Republic, the Greek Orthodox minority was ethnically cleansed over time after the treaty in Turkey, and issues of religious freedom, education, and cultural preservation underscore the ongoing challenges of implementing the original provisions. Furthermore, the Treaty of Lausanne did not anticipate the complexities of the modern geopolitical landscape. The discovery of substantial hydrocarbon reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean has amplified regional competition and exacerbated tensions between Hellas and Turkey, as well as Cyprus, with these nations asserting their rights to explore and exploit their resources, leading to disputes with neighboring countries and constant conflict, creating a web of disagreements. Conspiracy theory on the Treaty of Lausanne include claims in civil and formal circles in Turkey that the Treaty of Lausanne will expire this year in 2023. According to the conspiracy theory, quote, Turkey is forbidden to mine its natural resources, such as boron and petroleum, due to, quote, secret articles of the treaty. Therefore, Turkey will rapidly become a developing country by mining and exporting the resources once the treaty expires, which of course it hasn't. The legacy of the treaty is also intertwined with broader issues such as nationalism and regional power dynamics. The influence of major international actors, such as the United States, the European Union, and Russia, adds another layer of complexity to the situation. We hope that this discussion contributes with others an ongoing serious bilateral diplomatic dialogue leading to a peaceful resolution to current tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. Just for the audience, I'd like to just cite the key provisions of the treaty. One of the key provisions has to do with border and territorial adjustments. Another one has to do with the straits, regarding the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits. Another one has to do, obviously, with what we discussed before, which was the population exchange. We also discussed religious minority rights, and then another thing had to do with reparations and assets. We are again very grateful for the fantastic, distinguished panelists that we have today that I mentioned earlier, and I'd like to introduce the first panelist for a short presentation, and that's Stavros Terry Stavridis. Stavros Stavridis was born in Cairo, Egypt, and migrated with his parents to Australia. He has also lived in the United States and holds a master's degree in history from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, University. He has taught at the university and community college levels, both in Australia and the US. Terry is the author of 4 books and 5 contributing chapters on Greek-Turkish history, genocide, minorities, and historical fiction. Among his books includes The Tales from the Last Days of Anatolia, The Assyrians in Australian Documents, which he co-authored with someone else, The Greek-Turkish War, 1919 to 1923, and the Armenian massacres as reported in the Argus newspapers, 1894 to 98, again, co-authored with someone else. His research interests focus on the Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, Greece during the First World War, the Greek-Turkish War, 1919 to 1923, and wider Middle East history, which are based on primary sources from British, US, and Australian archives. He currently works as a freelance writer for the National Herald in New York City, writing history and historical fiction. Thank you for joining us today, Stavro.
Thank you, Louis, for the introduction. Welcome to all fellow panelists. Now, with the Treaty of Lausanne, where do you start? There are so many issues that were broached for discussion. I will focus on a couple for the purpose of our contribution today. Firstly, I would look at the issue of the Patriarchio. In the first phase of the Lausanne Conference, the Turks were quite insistent that the Patriarchio must be removed lock, stock, and barrel from Constantinople and probably put somewhere on Mount Athos. During the discussions, Ismet Pasha was very, very insistent that that must take place. But Venizelos cited historical issues like the church councils of the past, and it couldn't be done. Fortunately, the French, being so pro-Turkish at the time, said that, okay, the Patriarch can remain in Constantinople, but one thing, his political powers must be removed, and it just may be purely a religious institution. Now, the reason why the Turks took a dislike to the Patriarch at that time was because during the Greco-Turkish War of 1922, Patriarch Meletios was very much against the Turkish regime, especially against the Kemalists. And so they took a dislike to him. They considered him a traitor. But fortunately, after discussion in the about the issue. In the end, the US, France, Britain, in the end said no, it must remain there, and so in the end it stayed there, shorn of its political influence, and just be a religious institution. And of course, when we look at the minority rights in the Treaty of Lausanne, Articles 37 to 45, the issue of the patriarchy is not even stated, not even mentioned. So in the end, it just remained there, and it's just been ever since. The other issue that I have a great interest in is the issue of reparations. The Turks were always insistent that Greece had to pay reparations for damages during the course of that war. Now, one thing I'd like to state is that the Lausanne Conference was split into two periods. The first period was from November 1922 to early February 1923. And at that stage, they got very close to actually completing the negotiations and getting the treaty and its instruments signed. But the French kept egging on the Turks to reject. So in the end, it stalled. And then the conference restarted again in April and in 1923 and finished in July 1923 with the final signature and all the instruments that make up that document. Now, in May 1923, the Turks were really quite insistent that as Sicilianists, you must pay reparation, you must pay. But Venizelos told Ismet, and I'll just put it in a very comical way, Ismet, we've got a huge refugee crisis on our hands. How can we pay you? We don't have any money. No, you must pay. So Ismet contacted his masters in Angora, or Ankara as it was known then, and asked them, what should I do? And Mustafa Kemal and his government said, no, they got to pay. In the end, Venizelos said, if that's the way you are, we are going to abort the conference. And finally, a bit of common sense prevailed, because the Greeks actually threatened to go to war over this. And when the Allies got a wind of that, they shut it in their boots, because that meant that a new Greco-Turkish war would start over reparations. So in the end, what Venizelos offered them, and they accepted it, was a small triangle of territory, a strategic railway around Karagach, which is around Adrianople. And that's also, I think there's also a convention of Karagach in as one of the instruments to the Treaty of Lausanne. Now, another issue that I have a keen interest in is the issue of Mosul. Now, the British wanted Mosul, obviously, for the oil, and it formed part of their imperial communications through the Middle East onto their Indian sub-empire. Now, during the discussions, the Turks produced all sorts of things like the historical, population, economic reasons why it should remain in Turkey. But the British argued, said, no. This belongs to Mesopotamia, or of course it became known as Iraq. It must remain like that. And that issue was not resolved until 1926, when the League of Nations finally worked out the boundaries of what became between Iraq and Turkey. There are so many issues I could actually talk about this period, but I'd like to also throw in an Australian perspective. When I was doing my master's dissertation, and I did my Greco-Turkish War from the eyes of two Melbourne newspapers, the Argus, which is now obsolete, and the Age, which is still going strong today. In 1923, in January 1923, Ismet Pasha, during the discussions, talked about the Anzac Greys, because for Australia, Gallipoli and the Dardanelles have a great significance here. because Australia's first entry into World War One was fighting the Ottoman Turks on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Now, during 1923, the Turks actually said that they were going to dig up the Anzac graves, and of course the then Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes said that if you do that, that is a casus belli. And of course, Lord Curzon, who was the British Foreign Secretary, backed Australia. And at that stage, the Australia and New Zealand were prepared to go to war over this. But finally, common sense prevailed, and the Turks actually backed off. Now, after the signing of the treaty in 1923, in October of that year, 1923, the Australian Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, Stanley Bruce, visited London for the Imperial Conference, where they discussed all the things that affected the British Empire. And of course, the Lausanne Treaty was also discussed there as well. And on his way back in early 1924, he actually stopped off at the Anzac cemeteries on the peninsula at Gallipoli, and also visited Constantinople. So I believe that through my research, that Stanley Bruce was probably the first Western leader to visit the new Turkish state at that time. Now, he later became known as Lord Melbourne of Bruce, and he also represented Australia at the League of Nations in discussions that affected Australia's interest at that time. Another area which I've been doing some research, and unfortunately I can't get access to the Greek Foreign Ministry archives, unfortunately, at the time, because their website isn't working. I wrote a chapter in a book called New Perspectives on, I think, Modern Greek History. And I wrote about the Greek POWs and interned civilians from 1922 to 1929. It's about 25,000 words in length. And the horrible things that the Greek POWs suffered during the period of discussion at Lausanne and beyond is really horrific. And of course, in April of 1923, Trikoupis, who was the last commander-in-chief of the Greek army in Asia Minor, came back not impressed, and a lot of the Greek soldiers who came along with him as part of the first exchange looked very emaciated. They looked like skeletons with just a bit of skin on them. And also the issue of what we call about exchange of populations, compulsory exchange of I think that's really a misnomer, because the great majority of the Greeks had already left, were kicked out of Turkey in October 1922. And the only ones that came after that were, I think the last lot of Greeks that came to Greece from Asia Minor was in 1924. But generally speaking, the Treaty of Lausanne has no date on it, as the Turks suggest. And one of the things that I'd like to suggest also to is that there is no real definitive history being written on the Lausanne Conference, as far as I know, like the Paris Conference of 1919, like Margaret Macmillan wrote the Paris 1919, and she happens to be the granddaughter of whom I consider the great British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, pro-Greek. And finally, well, what I'd like to say is that I do dabble now in historical fiction. And the reason why I do that is to try and make history a little bit more interesting for the ordinary folk, because generally speaking, from what I see, the ordinary person is really not really interested in reading academic history. So I thought that trying to create fictional characters and place them in real events, I thought that would be, an interesting way. And I think Louis mentioned the book that I had, which is a collection of fictional short stories, is called Tales from the Last Days of Anatolia. Well, I'd like to inform you is that the book is being revised with additional short stories, and hopefully it will be released before Christmas in the US as such. So that's all I have to add about the Treaty of Lausanne. So hopefully we could get maybe a group of us to sit down and maybe work out and even bring in some Turks as well to actually write the history, because we can't be accused that we can't be all Greek, because they've got their own point of view that we need to consider as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Stavros, thank you so much for that. For the audience, the treaty, you can go on the internet and get the whole treaty, by the way. It was originally written in French, which was the diplomatic language, but it's also translated into English. So a simple a prompt on the internet, you can easily get it. There's about 143 articles relating to the particular treaty. Stavro mentioned some of the points, by the way, in the treaty itself, and the cemetery issue may sound like, oh, is that mentioned in a treaty? It is mentioned in a treaty very specifically. So it makes for very, very interesting reading. Also, reparations, what Stavro discussed in terms of reparations and things, that's also obviously mentioned in a treaty. Stavros is coming to us from Melbourne right now, so we thank you, Stavro, for getting up real early for this fascinating discussion on a treaty. The other thing you mentioned, Stavros, which I thought was very interesting, and it requires, I think, another discussion. But the discussion leading up to the treaty, because in fact we talk about one part of the signatories, let's say, and the other part. Okay, the one part being the British Empire at the time, France, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, Serb, Croat, Slovene state. That's one part, and then Turkey being the other part. But the one part was not necessarily united, Stavro, and you mentioned that basically. You mentioned the French, for example. The French were problematic in the so-called, Greco-Turkish War. Who did they support? They certainly didn't support the Hellenic state. And the reason why I say the so-called war is because Ismini Lamb and Chris Lamb had written a book also on Horton, where they basically bring up the point that, in fact, the forces were not there, because they wanted to necessarily go in there. But in fact, World War I was not over. Okay, the treaty was the last aspect of the closure of World War I, not 1918, but rather 1923. Stavro, thank you, and we'll come back, obviously, when we have the more general discussion. Our next presenter is independent scholar and author Nikos Nikoloudis. He obtained his PhD in the Department of Byzantine and Modern Studies at King's College in London. He is the organizer of 3 one-day conferences, a participant in 2 research programs, and 17 history conferences, and has authored or co-authored also 14 history books and many articles. He was the editor-in-chief of Historia Themata, Historic Themes, a monthly Greek historical journal. Niko is the editor of 5 collective volumes, including a dictionary on the Byzantine Peloponnese in the Hellenic, the 12th volume of journal Mesoios under the title Byzance, with studies of the Byzantine Empire, and to Mikrostatiko Ziktima Metamatia ton Xenon, the question of Asia Minor in the eyes of foreigners, written in Athens in this year, actually. His areas of research interest includes geographical, military, and socio-political history of the Hellenic Republic, Southeastern Europe, and the Middle East. Welcome, Niko, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for your invitation, Lou. Actually, what Stavros said was very interesting, but I will try and catch the thread of the story, if you like, a little bit earlier, and try and focus on 2 issues from the Greek point of view, which had a significant part in the formation of the Treaty of Lausanne. The first is the participation of Eleftherios Venizelos, not just as representative of Greece in the Conference of Lausanne, but as a mastermind behind all the diplomatic and political effort of Greece to the point of Lausanne, which terminated his efforts. And also, parallel to that, the concept of the megali idea, or the great idea, which was the Greek irredentism, if you like, ever since the formation of the Greek state in 1830, and how that was terminated in Lausanne, again through Venizelos, as a matter of fact. So, briefly speaking, the megali idea arose as such after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, but its official expression was only appeared in 1844 through a speech of Ioannis Koletis, the then prime minister, in the National Assembly, when the people there were discussing the formation of the first Greek constitution after the liberation of the Greek state. So, in that context, during the 19th century, Greece, the state of Greece, managed to expand somewhat in cases where it was in harmony with the wishes of the great powers of the time. And we have two incidences of that. In 1864, when the Ionian Islands were handed over to Greece from Great Britain. And secondly, in 1881, following the Congress of Berlin, when Thessaly and the region of Arta were handed over to Greece in the context of keeping a balance between the Balkan states at the time. On the other hand, there were great setbacks during the same period when Greeks tried to achieve what they wanted, the completion of the great idea, against the wishes of the great powers. And the two most prominent examples of that was the so-called Great Cretan Revolution of 1866, which was a great manifestation of Cretan resilience, but unfortunately didn't lead to anywhere, and the disastrous Greco-Turkish War of 1897. So, in the late 19th century, Greece had to confront two powers, local powers, in the effort to accomplish the great idea. One was the newest one, and the most dangerous at the time, was the newly independent Bulgarian state, which claimed ethnically mixed Balkan regions, including strong numbers of Greeks, such as Macedonia and Thrace. And the other, of course, was the Ottoman Empire, which was the traditional great power of the region, but in the state of collapse. So this is a period when Venizelos comes to the political scene in Greece. In 1910, he becomes the prime minister. And although he's essentially a pacifist and a modernist, if you like, his model was Harylos Trikoupis, the great modernizer, prime minister of Greece, who tried to build up the infrastructure of the country. He had Venizelos, on the other hand, despite his pacifist and modernizing ideas, had to immediately face a set of circumstances which would lead up to a series of wars. With the Balkans ready to explode during the Balkan Wars, and immediately afterwards, as we know, in 1914, the beginning of the First World War. So, during the period of 1912 and to 23, he had to participate in a series of conferences or international meetings, bilateral or multilateral, where he had to defend or promote the Greek rights in sets of circumstances which were rarely favorable, I would say, for Greek issues. And in that context, he often had to act more as a foreign minister of Greece rather than a prime minister as such. His main personal facts, if you like, which promoted his cause in a better way, or the fact that he conducted a personal diplomacy. He was a realist and he was also flexible. And these features were contributed significantly to the success of his tasks. One example, in 1912, just before the beginning of the First Balkan War, when the Balkan alliance had been formed between Serbia and Bulgaria. Venizelos intervened and tried to become a member of the alliance without really asking for any benefit from the other allies, despite the fact that they had already decided between them which territories were going to annex after the end of the war. So Venizelos said, okay, I'm not claiming any territory, and let just Greece join the struggle and see where it goes. And in this case, he managed, Greece, of course, liberated Macedonia and took the greatest part of it without having any previous arrangement. The reason why he did that is because otherwise Bulgarians would react and the whole alliance would be undermined and probably Greece would be left out. So he took the risk, but it came out. The second example, just a few months later, during the Conference of Bucharest, which terminated the Second Balkan War, Venizelos avoided to claim territories which had already been liberated by the Greek army, and those were territories east of the Nestos River, such as Dedeagaч, present Alexandroupoli, by naval contingents, and part of Western Thrace. The reason being again that he wanted to avoid further confrontation with Bulgaria and perhaps the great powers, since Bulgaria at the time was adamant in having access to the Aegean. So what he wanted and gained in the end was to annex Eastern Macedonia with the prosperous city of Kavala, and that he accomplished. This was also the time, on the other hand, when, following the disastrous outcome of the Balkan Wars for Turkey, the Greek genocide in Turkey starts taking place. It's interesting to note that one of the first known incidents of such genocide was the destruction of the coastal city of Phokia, just opposite Chios, on the 12th of June 1914. And I mention this because it took place after the end of hostilities between the Balkan countries and Turkey, and before the beginning of the First World War in August 1914, even more so before the entrance of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, which took place in November 1914. Despite that event, which was recorded by quite a few foreigners at the time, both photographically and as dispatches to newspapers, Venizelos was determined to come to some kind of arrangement with the Turkish government. And on the 21st of July 1914, he was on his way to Brussels to meet the Ottoman Grand Vizier to discuss the official termination of Greek Ottoman hostilities. But that didn't take place because during this journey, the ultimatum which Austria-Hungary handed over to Serbia, in which started really the First World War, had been handed. So it was obvious that hostilities were going to start any day. So this first effort for a Greco-Turkish understanding failed because of the beginning of the First World War. I won't go into the details of the Greek participation in the First World War. I'll just mention that at the end of it, in 1918, Greece had already 10 divisions on the Macedonian front, which proved critical in the termination of hostilities in that front, and eventually termination of hostilities in other fronts of the First World War. But it's important at that stage to note that soon after the hostilities, which we commemorated yesterday on the 11th of November in the Western Front, Venizelos had already prepared a memorandum which he submitted on the 30th of December of 1918, the last day, the day before the last of the end of the year, 1918, to the great powers as a basis of the Greek demands in the peace conference which was going to take place in Paris. And in that, he claimed for Greece the following regions: Northern Epirus, Thrace, Constantinople, Asia Minor, including Smyrna, and the Dodecanese, which were temporarily, supposedly at the time, under Italian control. The interesting detail of that memorandum, which hasn't been really noticed by most historians, even up to this date, is that near the end of the text, Venizelos made the specific mention of how he viewed the fate of Greeks living in Turkey at the time if Greece managed to have a foothold in Turkey. And he said the following. I've translated it from the original. He said that under the peace treaty, the Turkish government would be obliged to buy the landed property of Greeks living in its territory, talking about Asia Minor, of course, and wishing to migrate to Greek Asia Minor, the Greek zone that would be established, hopefully, at that time in Western Asia Minor. The Greek government will do the same with the land property of Ottomans wishing to migrate to Turkish Asia Minor, meaning the remaining Turkish territory in the whole of Asia Minor. Thus, a flow of mutual and voluntary immigration would take place, with the hopeful outcome that in the space of a few years, the population of the Turkish state will consist almost exclusively by Muslims. So he had the foresight to imagine a voluntary, at that point, exchange of populations within the context of Turkey, the Asia Minor, the region of Asia Minor. Of course, we know that it didn't happen that way, but I'm saying it because it shows that he wasn't completely unprepared for the eventuality of the exchange of population. So, moving on to the actual peace conference in 1919-20, in the Paris Peace Conference, it's important to note that Venizelos established a very good personal rapport with most key political figures and diplomats of the conference. To mention just the most important one of them was the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who called Venizelos a big man, a very big man. The American President Woodrow Wilson, who also called Venizelos at some point the biggest man I met. Lord Maurice Hankey, who was the secretary to the British cabinet, again calling Venizelos a big man. You see how they all viewed him as a bigger-than-life person in the conference. And finally, the distinguished British diplomat Harold Nicolson, who was also to meet Venizelos in the Lausanne conference, calling him overwhelmingly frank, genial, and subtle. On the other hand, Venizelos managed to promote the Greek cause by offering Greek support to issues that other big countries, great powers had at the table. For example, the US President Wilson was interested in the formation of the League of Nations. Venizelos became an adamant supporter to that cause, so much so that at a later stage, before the termination of the Paris Peace Conference, he was offered the chancellorship, which would have been what we would call today, in the context of the UN, the office of the General Secretary of the League of Nations, but he refused it because he wanted to dedicate himself to the completion of his Greek aims. To the French, he offered, as we know, the participation of Greek troops in southern Russia on the side of the French troops fighting the Bolsheviks who were advancing at the time all over the place. And to the British, of course, he offered an alliance for the control of the defeated Ottoman Empire. So, in that context, Greece, as we know, gained the one major advantage. In the first place, the landing of Greek armed force in Smyrna with the support of contingents of Italy and Great Britain, which would act as a police force in the Sanjak of Smyrna, the wider administrative territory. And that happened, as we know, on the 15th of May 1919 in the new style calendar. The other major victory was the concession of Western Thrace from Bulgaria through the Treaty of Neuilly in late in November 1919. That area was ceded originally to the Entente and then handed over to Greece during the San Remo conference, which took place in late April 1920. And the biggest achievement, of course, was the Treaty of Sèvres, signed on the 10th of August in 1920, in the course of which Turkey conceded to Greece the whole of the Sanjak of Smyrna, Eastern Thrace, and the islands of Imbros and Tenedos in the Aegean, plus the islands of the Sea of Marmara. All that was very good, and as we know, it didn't last, because in August and September of 1922, the whole of Ionia was destroyed, and the Greek populations were either massacred or forced to abandon the area and move to the Greek islands. During that period, as we also know, Venizelos was not in power. He had lost power in late in 1920 through the election, and he was living in exile as a private citizen in France. But despite his lack of official status, he had private contacts during this period with important persons, politicians of the time, trying to influence to whatever extent he could the circumstances to the favor of Greece. So we know that in autumn 1922, before the beginning of Lausanne, the Conference of Lausanne, he managed to convince the then pro-Turkish French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré to stop the Turks from crossing from Eastern Thrace to Western Thrace. Eastern Thrace had already been handed de facto to the Turks without being officially acknowledged as such, but the issue was far from over, as we know, and the Turks were demanding more and more. In this set of circumstances, he was assigned on the 21st of September by the newly established revolutionary Greek government the post of the official representative of Greece in the forthcoming Conference of Lausanne, which was about to start in November. Again, and that takes us to the climax of his diplomatic activities of the period, when he had to confront a multitude of issues in which Greece was already in a bad place to negotiate. That were, first of all, the final status of the islands of the Aegean, the central and northern Aegean islands. Also, he had to settle the Greek-Turkish border in Thrace, which, as I said, was anything but determined. Also, another issue was the exchange of populations, the protection of minorities, and finally, the thorniest issue of all, the war compensations demanded by Turkey. And then again, what saved to some extent the day was his high prestige among foreign politicians. In that case, he had to deal, at least in the early stages of the conference, with two old acquaintances, the first being Premier Poincaré of France, who, however, did not participate in the actual works of the conference. He left after the first day. Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary, who was presiding over the conference for most of the period, and of course his old acquaintance Harold Nicholson, the British diplomat. On the other hand, this didn't mean so much, because most diplomats, despite their respect for him, all foreign diplomats I mean, had to consider their own country's interests, and they were very much different from what Greece wished. I have to point out here again that the Turkish attitude throughout at least the first stage of the conference, which lasted from November till late January 1924, was maximalist and indecisive. The Turks wanted everything, but at the same time, they avoided closing any issue. They kept protracting the discussions, pushing in the Oriental style of bargaining without coming to a deal. And that led to the abrupt termination of the conference, as we know, on the 30th of January, which lasted for 75 days, this breakup. Before that, Venizelos had been cornered rather, by his counterparts in the conference, but managed to manipulate the situation, at least as far as the population exchange issue was concerned, by forcing a solution which at first sight seemed detrimental to Greece. That is, the compulsory status of the exchange of population. Every type of exchange of population that had taken up to that point, not between Greece and Turkey, but throughout any international arrangement, had the voluntary character. This was the first time that a conference had decided on the compulsory status of the population exchange. This seemed very harsh, of course, to the Greek people at the time, but from Venizelos' point of view, it was necessary for one simple reason. If there was no agreement, formal agreement, on this issue, which would formalize the necessity of the population exchange, Turkey would have a free hand to complete it at its own leisure, not by just forcing out the Ionian Greek populations, but also other Greek populations living in the hinterland of Turkey, like the Pontians, the ones in Cappadocia, and so on. Plus, and eventually, the turn of Greeks in Constantinople and the Patriarchate would be in the hands of Turkey. So what Venizelos did was to persuade the negotiator of the League of Nations for this issue of population exchange, the Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen, who was the High Commissioner and was negotiating with the Turks in Constantinople, to accept, or propose rather, but without mentioning that it was Venizelos' idea, this compulsory exchange of population. And that was what eventually took place with the signing of the Convention for the Exchange of Populations, right at the end of the first phase of the Lausanne Treaty on the 31st of January 1923. In that context, Venizelos secured the peaceful departure of approximately 300,000 remaining Greeks in Turkey, the protection, as I mentioned, of the Ecumenical Patriarchate as an institution based in Constantinople, and the protected continuity of the livelihood of Greece in Constantinople, plus the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, in exchange, of course, for the Muslims living in Western Thrace who would stay in their places of where they lived without having to forcefully be expelled like Muslims in Macedonia, for example. During the second and last phase of the conference, which lasted from the 23rd of April until the 24th of July, in 1923, when the treaty was finally signed, Venizelos established a very good personal rapport with İsmet Pasha, his main opponent in the conference, and leader of the Turkish delegation. Surprisingly so, we may say, because İsmet was not a diplomat, he was a general, and he was the one who actually beat the Greek troops in the final battle of the struggle in Asia Minor. But he impressed him so much so that he even managed to invite him for a dinner at his residence in Lausanne, which of course İsmet had to deny for reasons of appearance, as we understand. Finally, at the end of the whole conference, Venizelos again managed to successfully blackmail, we can say, İsmet to accept the concession of the Treaty of Karagach which is the only suburb of Adrianople west of River Evros, and actually was largely inhabited by Greeks at the time. Incidentally, it was also the place of origin of my paternal grandfather. So this was the exchange that Venizelos offered to the Turks for dropping the continuous demand for Greek war reparations. As Mr. Stavridis mentioned before, Greece was in no condition to offer any reparations because the termination of hostilities had meant that, and the arrival of refugees had meant that Greece was bankrupt, essentially. But on the other hand, an asset that Greece had at the time, and the Turks had to consider, was that under General Pangalos, the Greek army had reorganized in west of Hebros and was ready to start new hostilities if the conference didn't come to a result. So the pressure that Venizelos placed in this set of circumstances worked, because it was not only the great powers like France and Britain that didn't want any more hostilities. It was also other sides that came out on Venizelos's side, like the Yugoslav ambassador at the conference called Jovanovic, who also threatened with Turkey with war on behalf of Yugoslavia, and also secretly, but we know it now, the Soviet foreign minister who was present at the conference, Mr. Chicherin, and I remind here that the Soviet Union was allied essentially with Turkey at the time, also pressed for the signing of the peace treaty because the Soviet Union didn't want new hostilities, which would bring back the Allies in the Straits territory that would otherwise remain open, as it did eventually, to all peacekeeping powers. Of course, despite the fact that the Treaty of Lausanne saved the day, in a sense, for Greece, we know that not all issues were finalized at the time, and it took Venizelos a few more years, until 1930, to finalize this cordial arrangement with Turkey by going to Ankara and signing there the final Treaty of Ankara with Mustafa Kemal. So I'll close my presentation here, hoping that I haven't bothered you too much with details.
No, Nico, you didn't bother us at all. Small question for you, for us and the audience. You mentioned a memorandum that was written by Venizelos. How do we get a copy of that? What research has been done on that? Is it on the internet or not?
Not to my knowledge. I am aware of it because I have 4 volumes of Venizelos's documents that have been published by the Leski Phileleftheron in Athens many years ago, and the whole memorandum is published there. This is just a small extract, but if anyone is interested, and I think you might have noticed, Lou, it's reprinted partially, including this bit, in the collective volume which has just come out and which I edited and have also contributed to, the Asia Minor question in the eyes of foreigners. Of course, it's in Greek again, but it's the only place, as far as I know, that one can find it recently without having to dig in, old bibliography and all that.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that in a general discussion. Thank you, Nico. Our next presenter is John Papaspanos. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a former Fulbright scholar in Thessaloniki, Greece. He is currently a partner in the project finance group of the international law firm of Baker Botts, LLP, at their law office in New York City. John represents private equity firms, sponsors, developers, public and private companies, lenders, and equity investors on the complex and novel project finance and other transactions, mainly in the energy sector. He is a board member of the Hellenic American Chamber of Commerce and the Hellenic Lawyers Association. Welcome, John, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Lou, for having me. And that was such a robust background and context that Professor Nikoloudis provided us, that I'm going to try to keep the background aspects of my remarks pretty brief. I'm only going to highlight some of the prominent developments that lead up to the Treaty of Lausanne, just to have a basis for understanding what was going on in the time on the ground in terms of the factual realities. So the first, obviously, is the 1453 fall of Constantinople. That was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and this catastrophe became a historical trauma that resonates to Greek in the Greeks' public collective conscious even to this day. And from there, we had 400 years of Ottoman rule in Greece. And in 1821, as we all know, the Greeks revolted and established the modern Greek state in 1830. And then in the late 19th century, as Professor mentioned, we had this idea of the megali idea, the great idea, by which Greece could somehow reconquer Istanbul and resurrect the Byzantine Empire. And fueled by this grand, ambitious idea, Greece attacked the Ottoman Empire in 1897. There they suffered a stinging defeat. And then, however, the tables did turn eventually in the Balkan Wars in 1913, when Greece annexed the regions of Macedonia, Epirus, and eastern Thrace. And then World War I erupted. That was from 1914 to 1918. And the Allies included Serbia, Russia, France, Britain, Italy, and the US. And they were opposed by the Central Powers, which consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And the result of that great war was the fall of four great imperial dynasties. So it was the Germans, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and then Russia fell victim to the Bolshevik Revolution, right? So Tsar Nicholas fell. So after all this chaos, we had a series of peace treaties where the victorious allies imposed punitive peace terms to the three great empires that participated in the war and lost, right? And the Treaty of Lausanne was the last of those peace treaties, and it's the one that still exists today, the only one that exists today. There is a little nuance and a wrinkle that I want to mention a little bit about the predecessor treaty, the Treaty of Stavridis, and that was entered into in August of 1920. That was the initial treaty that was entered into between the victorious Allied powers of World War I and the Ottoman Empire. And that's where the city of Smyrna actually was assigned to Greece. Smyrna was a very liberal, cosmopolitan trading city with a huge Greek community. And well, even before the Treaty of Stavridis, there was even another development I didn't mention earlier, the San Remo Conference. And there we had Britain and France divvy up the territories of the Ottoman Empire south of Turkey. And Britain was actually granted the Mandate of Palestine at that time, April 1920. And then it was approved by the League of Nations, which is really relevant today. Anyway, going back to the Treaty of Stavridis in 1920, later on in that year, the Treaty of Stavridis was signed in August. And I think October of that year of 1920, Eleftherios Venizelos commanded the Greek army, and fueled by the Megali Idea and some support from Philhellenes, like the British Prime Minister, he tried to fight in Anatolia and try to attack Ankara, and he failed. And Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was the leader of the Turkish troops, surrounded the Greek army, and forced the Greeks to flee. And Smyrna, as we all know, the great catastrophe was put in flames with heavy loss of life. And then in 1921 to 1922, there was the Greco-Turkish War, when Greece had to surrender Smyrna, Eastern Thrace, and including Adrianople. That leads us to the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. July 1923 was when it was signed in Lausanne, Switzerland. There, the signatories were the Allied powers, the victors of World War I, and then Turkey, which was the successor state to the Ottoman Empire. So it was a little bit of an awkward situation because we have the victors of World War I on one side of the table and the losers of World War I. However, those allies just lost military battles in the interim. In that 2-year short period, the allies tried engage in skirmishes with Turkey, and Ataturk was winning on the ground. So they were negotiating against the loser of World War One, but at the same time, the Turks had a great negotiation bargaining power because they were winning on the war front, and that resulted in Turkey getting most of what they wanted in the negotiations. So I want to make a few quick comments on some of the other commentary that we heard so far. Regarding reparations, it's important to note, not only did Greece successfully negotiate to not give reparations to Turkey, but importantly, likewise, Turkey was not obligated to pay any reparations to the Allied powers for World War One or otherwise. So that's one note. The other note is just to take a quick step back, looking at this treaty at a fundamental level. What is it? It's essentially the birth certificate for Turkey, modern day Turkey. You recognize the boundaries of the modern state of Turkey. It created the political and economic autonomy of Turkey. And for example, Turkey's share of the Ottoman Empire's debt was dramatically reduced. And Turkey has no claims over the oil-rich Arab provinces in the former Ottoman Empire, which was a really important negotiation point for Britain and France. And then also, Turkey recognized the British possession of Cyprus and the Italian possession of the Vicanis. So basically it lays out the geopolitical framework of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it created a lasting peace until today. There's more to come on that point later. But just to go through two very quick topics, the treatment of minority populations and the idea of self-determination, the Wilsonian concept. So first, the treatment of minorities. The treaty regulated rights of minorities, which is defined as non-Muslims living in Turkey. To understand minorities in Turkey today, you have to understand the Treaty of Lausanne and how it came to be. But the treaty, obviously we talked about it a few times. The treaty is known for having this massive compulsory population exchange around in the 1920s. I think it was around 2 million people had to relocate. So the Muslims in Greece moved to Anatolia and vice versa. The Greeks in Anatolia went to Greece. So the question is, the overarching legacy of the Treaty of Lausanne is, how should governments govern people whose identities do not fit with the historically dominant group's identity? So in Turkey, where you have the dominant group is the Turkish Muslim group, how do we govern in the context where the minorities are Christian, minorities are Greek, or maybe Armenian? Do they have representation in the government? Do they have equal rights? Do they have anti-discrimination protections? These are the same type of themes that we see very often, even to this day, very relevantly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a very good case study to see how did they handle this so many years ago, 100 years ago. How did the signatories of the Treaty of Lausanne, the international law, legal system at the time, and the major powers, how did they face this issue? And I think an overarching conclusion is, while the treaty did guarantee certain rights for all the populations, it was a failure in terms of delivering what we call a modern pluralist society, in which there's a heterogeneous group of people that live together, coexist, and they have common representation in the government. And that's a lasting part of the Treaty of Lausanne's legacy, that we have homogeneity in Greece, in Turkey, and the consequences of that to this day. So the international law consequences of having this population exchange, by the way, is that it becomes a potential option. It's a potential solution to a very complex and difficult problem. How do we have heterogeneous societies? So for example, it was an antecedent to the partition of India and Pakistan. This is what they looked at and said this was an option in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there was population mixing in India and Pakistan. They said we should separate the two. That was one policy that they enacted, at least partly based on what they viewed as the success of the Treaty of Lausanne. However, over the past few decades, I think we revisited this concept of unmixing, this concept of peacemaking through forcibly changing the location of the ethnic groups and the religious groups so they're concentrated with other people of the same group. And now many people can even characterize this as ethnic cleansing, right? Which is a concept that's related to genocide. And with that, let's turn now to the other major theme of self-determination, especially for the Armenians and the Kurds. So the Armenian delegation at the conference at Lausanne, they had one major aim. That was to be granted in an autonomous region within Turkey, either in eastern Turkey or northern Syria, where they would be living in what they called Armenian national home. It would be demilitarized area where the Armenians could practice self-rule and express their culture and their religion safely. Because remember, we're on the heels of the Armenian genocide during World War I, when the Young Turks killed millions of Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, through mass killings and mass deportations, which inevitably resulted in death and destruction. And one thing to note is there was a big debate as to whether Armenia would be able to get granted this autonomous region at the conference. But in light of some factors I'm about to describe, the Turkish leaders successfully rebuffed these proposals for an Armenian home within Turkey. And partly, or I would argue that the major reason was of the military success of Ataturk at the time and the bargaining power that they had militarily. But it wasn't just a lack of military leverage that the Allies lacked. It might have been, another factor is the lack of moral standing. So the Turkish press, they ran many stories about colonial misdeeds of the British and the French, especially in Africa and other colonies that they had, and even stories about the Ku Klux Klan in the US. They all were aiming to show that the Allied powers themselves have mistreated minority groups. So who are they to school and educate Ottomans about their treatment of the minorities in their country, especially at a time when there was war? That was the Turkish viewpoint. And they try to highlight the double standard of imperialism. And that was successful. Between that factor and the military bargaining power of Turkey, there was no justice for the Armenian genocide and the other Ottoman Empire crimes. There was no accountability for the perpetrators who committed these crimes against humanity. We don't know the actual source of that international law concept of crimes against humanity, but a lot of sources do point to the Ottoman genocide of Armenians as being a potential source of that concept. In fact, the Treaty of Lausanne doesn't even mention the Armenians once. And if you look at a provision in the treaty, it actually has an exculpation provision. So the signatories renounced all claims for the loss and damage suffered between August 1914 and the signing date of the treaty as a result of acts of war or measures of requisition, sequestration, disposal, or confiscation. Wow, that sounds like a blanket waiver. Basically, it was very convenient that they added this because it covers all the different crimes and damages associated with the genocide that they committed. So that to me was really tough to read, that provision. And so Turkey's Armenian population became a minority group with mostly equal rights on paper, but they often faced discrimination in practice. Actually, one of the journalists, a French journalist, Ara Touranian, he has said of the treaty that it was the crime of the century that came after the crime of the century, only accepting the Holocaust as an exception. But what he says is not only was there a genocide, but equally, if not more important, was that there was no justice, there was no accountability, there was no recourse or redress. Those are the two major crimes against the Armenians and other minorities at the behest of the Ottoman Empire. Now, I'll close this topic with the idea of self-determination. So not only are we dealing with the specific dynamics between the signatories of the treaty, we're also dealing with the international legal structure at the time. And at the time, there was this concept called self-determination. It was the main promoter was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who won the Nobel Peace Prize as the main architect of the League of Nations. And he promoted this idea that a nation, which is a group of people with similar political ambitions, can seek to create its own independent state. For the Armenians, the Kurds, and other minorities, self-determination was denied to them. And that is another lasting legacy of the Treaty of Lausanne, the failure to acknowledge and create accountability of the Ottoman Empire crimes and the successor state of Turkey, and the failure to have redress. Like all the confiscated property, all the destruction, lives lost, everything was just swept under the rug by a single provision of the treaty. So with that powerful thought, I leave you to that my remarks have ended.
Thank you, John. But what we should mention to the audience is part of the treaty related to, as was indicated earlier, the Hellenic population or the Greek Orthodox population that could remain in Constantinople or Istanbul, and also on the islands. And then what was mentioned also is the Muslim population in Thrace. But to the point of a solution, so it wasn't really a solution, because even after the signing of the treaty, obviously those populations were ethnically cleansed, because in 1923, a third of the population, for example, of Istanbul was in fact Greek Orthodox. And today, if you can find 10,000 Greek Orthodox in Constantinople, it would be a lot. Whereas, for example, the population in Thrace, in Western Thrace, has multiplied. Okay, so there are definitely issues in terms of some of the issues that were mentioned, whether it was reparations or things relating to genocide. Don't forget that after the 1920 Treaty of Cervez, that in fact it was a different ballgame, and after 1922. So therefore, some of the things that were in that particular treaty that would have addressed some of these issues did not exist. I have to add also, in terms of the genocide, we mentioned the Armenian genocide, but during that period, there was also obviously the Greek Orthodox genocide, as well as the Assyrian genocide. So the Israeli professors on their 30-year genocide, 1894 to 1924, relate. The way they looked at it is just the concept of a Christian genocide. In other words, it was a genocide of all Christians. With that, thank you, and we'll come back to some of these issues. Our final presenter is Peter Stavrianidis. Dr. Stavrianidis is a frequent participant, speaker here with EMBCA. He is a successful entrepreneur and has served in numerous leadership positions within the Hellenic American community, having held posts that related to Hellenic issues of the diaspora and the genocide in Asia Minor and certainly in Pontus. This includes, in his capacity as the past president of the Pan-Pontian Federation of the U.S. and Canada, and being currently the president of the Federation of Hellenic Societies in New Jersey. Peter occasionally teaches as an adjunct professor, including at various institutions, but including also the Fashion Institute of Technology at SUNY. He is also a research associate at the Pantheon University of Athens, the School of Social and Political Science. He has done extensive research in the evolution of Greek America, modern Hellenic history, and the Asia Minor genocide. He is currently conducting a postdoc on the Jews of Greece. He is an archon of the Order of St. Andrew the Apostle, and on the Education Committee of the Metropolis of New Jersey. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for this glorious introduction. Thank you so much. The last time in recent years that the Lausanne Treaty topic resurfaced itself was back in the 90s, especially with the EMEA crisis. And of course, lately, we encounter this treaty in the political language and diplomatic language, especially between the Greek and the Turkish diplomats, and of course the aspirations of the Turkish leader Erdogan and his revisionistic tendencies about the Lausanne Treaty. But to better understand the role and the significance of the treaty, it would be extremely important to consider the historical, geopolitical, and economic state of affairs during that time period that these events are taking place. The Enlightenment has a great effect in the way of political thinking in Europe at the time, and especially the Balkans and somewhat the Ottoman Empire and the movement of the Young Turks. So the Enlightenment is the moving force that caused the end of the empires, which were mostly multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, and they to become nation states. So the sense of nationalism can exist successfully only under unique characteristics. Homogeneity is the main ingredient, and Greece, of course, was the first Balkan country to declare its independence and become a nation with the Protocol of London in 1830. Let's start by mentioning that the Treaty of Lausanne annuls, voids, akironi, the Treaty of the Serbs, which had been signed in August 1920 and which literally partitioned the Ottoman Empire, diminished it to a fraction of its original territory, and its signatories included the victorious allies of World War I and representatives of the Ottoman Empire, which, of course, at that juncture of history was at its nadir. Let me remind you that the collapse of the Greek army in the Anatolian front against the revolutionary army of Kemal Atatürk took place either at the end of August or the beginning of September, depending on which calendar we're using. The collapse led to a chaotic retreat with unprecedented losses and a humiliating defeat, the worst, without a doubt, in the history of Hellenism. This massacre of the Greek army and the remaining Greek populations in Asia Minor came to an end with the intervention of Great Britain, France, and Italy, and the details of an armistice after fierce deliberations in Moudagna on September 1922, with Greece accepting it 2 days later, after it was determined. In the beginning, they refused to sign it because part of the agreement was for Greece to abandon Eastern Thrace, although demographically, the Greek population is more dominant in Eastern Thrace than the Western Thrace. So Ismet Pasha or Ismet Inonu arrives in Moudagna 2 days before the Greek representatives and strikes a deal that the whole Eastern and Western Thrace would go to Turkey. But of course, Greece denied it, declined adamantly that, but they had to agree for Eastern Thrace to become part of the so-called Turkish Republic. So eventually they did sign. Why did they sign? Because Venizelos, as you mentioned before, the previous speakers, he was a pragmatist. He didn't become emotional as other leaders, and that's why he was so likable. He was very likable by all the leaders, all the signatories, including Ismet Pasha and later Kemal Atatürk. So a month later, on November 20th, 1922, the deliberations for the Treaty of Lausanne commenced in the Swiss city of Lausanne. In these deliberations, which lasted till the conclusion of the treaty, with a break, of course, between February and April, besides Turkey and Greece, the other nations that participated were the following: Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Romania, and Serbia. The Soviet Union was invited to participate only during the discussion about the Dardanelles Straits, and Bulgaria was given the opportunity to discuss her situation vis-a-vis access to the Aegean as well access to the Dardanelles Straits. The Lausanne Treaty was composed of 143 articles and was distributed over 17 documents. During the first part of the conference, from November 20th, 2022 till February 2023, the only topic that was covered was the exchange of the populations, which, as was mentioned before, was the first compulsory exchange in the history based solely on religion. Now, why the Turkish representatives were very adamant about the basis of the exchange of population is the identity of religion, not the ethnic identity or the language spoken by the populations. Now, 1,650,000 Greek Orthodox Christians, not necessarily Grecophones, were exchanged for about 650,000 Muslims, and many of those Muslims didn't even speak the Turkish language. Most of them didn't either, and they didn't even have a Turkish identity. But Turkey thought and saw that it would be much easier to jettison many more populations, Christian populations, and that's what they managed to do. You see, they came from a point of being the winner of the battle between the Greek and the Turkish Revolutionary Army. The Lausanne Treaty is the equivalent to what is Greek Independence Day to Greece. So that said, the Lausanne Treaty is a treaty of defeat for Greece. The Treaty of Serbs was in accord with the Megali Idea, creating the nation of Hellas, of the two continents and the 5 seas. So when it comes to Greek foreign policy, besides, of course, the US today, which is the main ally and world power, having taken that role from Great Britain after World War II, Greco-Turkish relations take the main stage since the establishment of the modern Greek nation in 1830. So some of the details of deliberations, and of course we said compulsory exchange of populations, the first one and the last in the global history that such an event has taken place. The two countries, Greece and Turkey, could only come. Let me back for a second and say that almost everything that characterizes the Lausanne Treaty was agreed upon, always taking in consideration what is the benefits for the powers, the great powers at the time, especially Great Britain. Fortunately, if there was one country that was a little bit to our favor, was Great Britain, not France. And that had nothing to do that the French were not Philhellenes. But here, I want to add to the information of the previous speakers that France had lent tons of money to Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire. And at that particular point, Turkey was on the verge of economic collapse, of bankruptcy. So one of the reasons that France was on the side of Turkey in many of those issues because of this issue. Now, what do we learn from the Lausanne Treaty? As I said before, it is a treaty of defeat for Greece in comparison to the Sèvres Treaty. With the Sèvres Treaty brought an unfounded optimism, which under the circumstances wasn't a realistic scenario. And on top of everything, it was a major contributing factor, bringing a sense of unity and nationalism between the opposing parties, the Kemalist revolutionary government and the Sultan's national government. We also must remember that Greece's campaign in Asia Minor started before the Sèvres Treaty had taken place, which makes this treaty immediately less powerful from its inception. In other words, it does not contain any mandate for Greece to disembark military force in Smyrna and proceed in Anatolia towards Ankara. It is a crucial document to study and learn from it for any contemporary Hellene and aspiring politician, especially in reference to how Greece should conduct itself should conduct its internal and external politics, how to maintain a consistent and robust strategic policy vis-a-vis our allies and our occasional predators, especially our neighbor from the east, Turkey. To understand the interest of our allies, especially the US, not the way we would like them to be, because as I believe it was De Gaulle that had said many years ago, in international politics, there are no friendships, there are only interests. Greece must have a respectable army which can defend swiftly and effectively any aggression from anywhere. An education that teaches history with its great and not so great moments. A patriotism that is necessary for a nation state. I don't mean to be nationalistic, but you can't have a nation state if there's no patriotism there. I'm sorry to say that, but again, it's a fact. And of course, that's another topic. I don't want to deviate from today's topic. The Lausanne Treaty is the end of the Megali Idea. but it's the beginning of a contemporary Greece that brings together and homogenizes its population. It generates gradually a strong ethnic identity, which also creates a Greece which becomes introverted and loses its cosmopolitanism, as the well-known politician Evangelos Venizelos very eloquently discusses in one of his presentations. Because don't forget, we had Greeks, Greek Orthodox community in Smyrna, Constantinople. So it gave Hellenism this cosmopolitan character. The recognition that the modern Greek nation or kingdom at the time of its genesis is established and recognized as, I have to say, protectorate of the great powers, with the understanding and the obligation to contribute to the defense against any possible aggression from the north, either at the time from the Tsarist Russia, which later became the Soviet Union. And here I want to say something about Eastern Thrace. One of the reasons why the Allies, especially Great Britain, supported the allocation of Eastern Thrace to the Turkish Republic is this way. You can have in the Western Thrace the Greek army, and the Eastern Thrace, the Turkish army, should, if there is an aggression from the north, especially the Soviet Union. The Lausanne Treaty is the final disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of the Turkish Republic, which is a nation state. The treaty, though it clearly describes the influence and extent of the Ottoman Empire in the region that extends from the Balkan Peninsula, Asia Minor, the Caucasus, and basically all the Middle Eastern nations that emerged from its collapse. The treaty is not Greco-Turkish, is not Balkan, is not European. It involves every single one of today's geopolitical confrontations, and I'll mention a few. Nagorno-Karabakh, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Israel and Palestine, Cyprus, and all the disputes and revisionistic tendencies of Turkey vis-a-vis the Aegean, the Muslim minority of Thrace. And last, and certainly not least, the Kurdish issue. What do we do with 40 million Kurds that are dispersed in at least 3 or 4 of these countries, most of them in Turkey? The Lausanne Treaty, by the way, does not allow for the formation of the Kurdish nation. The Lausanne Treaty is alive and directly or indirectly in every major conflict and geopolitical confrontation in the Middle East. Yes, even in Europe. Even in the Ukraine conflict is connected to the Lausanne Treaty. And I finish my presentations here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I will say a couple of things in terms of the population exchange and why the insistence, because you mentioned that, Peter, there was an insistence relating to doing that. And a lot of it had to do with philosophically what was taking place within Turkey itself and the nationalistic tendencies of what you had going on. And one thing we never mention or really talk about, but I like to talk about on occasion, and you'll hear the name, that I constantly bring up when we talk about that, which is basically Ziga Gökalp, who's what they call the Grand Master of Turkish nationalism, or the Grand Master of Turkism. And that had to do with basically creating a nation relating to Turks. Okay, they didn't want other people, and obviously they blamed some of these other populations. I mean, this is the Turkish let's say comment They blamed other populations for being involved in the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. In other words, get rid of these people. Don't forget, even during the Hellenic Revolution, or before the Hellenic Revolution, let's say in the 1770s, where we had the Orlov Rebellion, one of the things that was brought up to the Sultan, or the Sultan brought up actually, is let's exterminate everybody in the Peloponnesus and basically bring in Muslims in the area. And told, the Kapitan Pasha said to him, "Hey, who's going to pay the taxes if you do that type of thing?" So the concept that those type of concepts were not new historically. I would like to, and in terms of the British, and in terms, I like the comment, by the way, no friends, just interests. I like your comment because in reality, I see basically pawns by the great powers. Okay, everyone's using their pawns in order to do what they want to do. There was mentioned before, I think it was Nico mentioned Kabul, okay, and the oil fields that were there. There was a lot of things happening behind the scenes. Even though we have a treaty, I think this is a separate discussion, but I think we have to jump into this again in the future and really start diving into some of the issues that we were talking about. I was fascinated by what Nico said, that in fact some of the so-called memorandums that Venizelos wrote, that fascinated me because it almost implies, correct me if I'm wrong, Nico, it almost implies that Venizelos wanted to go into Smyrna and some of these other places that you were talking about. And I have to ask everybody the same question. Let me ask this question and just get your opinions on this. The war was not over on November 11th, 1918. Am I wrong in this? This was a consequence. What took place eventually, which was the end of the war, was basically this treaty, because the war was not over. Am I wrong on this?
No, you're not wrong. If I may jump into the conversation.
Yeah, please. No, please.
First of all, let's not forget that in November 1918, there was an armistice, not a conclusion of hostilities. The end of the war was the Treaty of Versailles, as far as Germany was concerned, which was 2 years later. As far as the Balkans were concerned, and the Ottomans in particular, that was the Treaty of Sevres in 1920, which was whole 2 years after the war. And let's remember that this was the last of the peace treaties that was signed because it was the most complex. And by the way, if I may add a few bits in relation to what other speakers mentioned, the Treaty of Sevres didn't work because it was too complicated and it didn't settle any issue adequately. For example, Armenia, which was mentioned, and the complaints of Armenians, if I may use the term, in Lausanne, where Armenia had been written off really in 1920, despite President Wilson's wish to create a counterbalance on the eastern side of Turkey along the Greek counterbalance in Smyrna, which would be on the west side, to balance the Turkish nationalism. Armenia was in no position to do that. Armenians had the area of Armenia had practically been depopulated because of the genocide. So the newly established Armenian state did not have the manpower to support the existence of the Armenian state. Moreover, because Kemal knew that, only in a couple of months after the Treaty of Sevres had managed to wipe out the Armenian independence. I mean, even before the Greek election that in November 1920 kicked Venizelos out of power, Armenians had been forced to surrender on the harshest terms, which was exactly what Kemal had ordered his general, Kazim Karabekir, who was in charge of that front, enforce on them, on the Armenians, the harshest possible terms, so that they don't bother us anymore, they don't trouble us. And as if that was not enough, of course, the Kemalists came to an understanding with the Soviets, and they invaded Armenia at the same time. So they stabbed the Armenians in the back, and they forced them, they established a new communist government, which negotiated the formal treaty with Kemalist Turkey that put Armenia out of the game, if you like. So that was why they didn't have any chance in Lausanne, the Armenians. On some other issues, if I may add, the minority rights in Turkey after 1923, which were guaranteed for non-Muslims, the remaining non-Muslims, not Greeks or Armenians, of course, but there were other smaller communities like the Jews, like the Catholics, Catholic communities that survived in many parts. The Turks didn't respect any of that at all. There has been a book in Greek, which will probably be published soon in English in America, because I've done the English translation of that, by Professor Theodosis Kyriakidis in Thessaloniki, who has researched the Vatican archives on the Greek and Armenian genocide in Anatolia. And he has expanded on that issue as late as the late 1920s. And he's proven through documents and reports submitted by missionaries and Catholic priests in Turkey that the Turks didn't respect any of the commitments undertaken in Lausanne. They kept on putting pressure on the remaining Christians, the Catholic, for that matter, Catholic Christians, to get out of Turkey.
Yeah.
So that's another side effect of the Lausanne Treaty. But
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, guys.
If I may, here.
Yeah,
this way we can change, regarding the Armenian issue, the idea that was also to have a mixed country, a mixed nation with Armenians and Pontian Greeks. Okay, so that was part. But you see, Venizelos, as I said before, he was a pragmatist. He couldn't support such a solution, especially with the presence of the Greek army, because it would be a huge front that they couldn't cover, and militarily was not. He made, going back to the personality of Venizelos, sometimes he had to make decisions that he took political cost for that. Especially in 1930, after the Lausanne Treaty, he developed a friendship with Kemal Atatürk. He even
recommended him for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, and regarding about the reparations of the exchange, in 1930, they came to an agreement and they finalized that we are even, although 1,650,000 Greeks that were mostly merchants, bankers, business people, real estate owners, vis-a-vis the 650,000 Muslim population from Greece that were mostly agrotes, in agriculture. They were farmers, mostly. And another thing, another characteristic, but of course it's a different topic, but I have to mention it, that 650,000, very few of those that were ethnic Turks. There were either Greeks that had, by force or by choice, if you will, become Muslim, or as part of the Arvanites. That's another topic that maybe in the future we can discuss. Sometimes history doesn't want to touch that, but there were Christian Arvanites and Muslim Arvanites. So here the Muslim Arvanites, they speak Greek, they have a Greek identity, but they happen to be Muslim, So all of them, or most of them, are transferred to Turkey. So these...
May I correct you on this? The Muslim Albanians, the Stavridis, were allowed by special arrangement to remain in Greece. And that's why I had the problem of their collaboration with the Axis.
With the Nazis,
yeah.
But all of them, Nico, the rest of them, or the majority of them, against their volition, against their will, they were, and they were not even ethnic Turks. Of course, you can say, if you look at Turkey today, how many are ethnic Turks? If you go to Istanbul, you're going to see Turks with the blonde and blue eyes, mostly Slavics, all right? Slavs that have been either by force or by their own will become, we know that. So anyway, it was a strange situation. We know that. But at this time, the Lausanne Treaty supposedly expires at the end of the 100 years. And I think
No.
I
Hold
think
on.
supposedly-
No,
That's a myth.
no.
That's
It's
a
a myth.
myth.
It
That's
is
a
a myth.
myth.
I'm not saying it's true. It's a fact. I'm not saying it's a fact.
Where do you what article is that, Peter?
No, the Turks say that. The
Yeah, well,
Turks
the Turks say that, but it's false.
But that's a conspiracy theory. We mentioned that.
Yeah.
But
You know what amazes me, without mentioning any names, that some of the Greek politicians, and I'm not going to mention any political party, they leave that vague. It's to them. Although nowhere in the articles, and I've read most of it, not all of it, most of it, it doesn't mention that after 100 years, it's the end. As long as there's peace, only if there's a war, only if there's another war, then probably another, after negotiation and deliberations. But since then, there was no war between Greece and Turkey. So nobody can say that it expires. That's what I meant to say.
Something. Stavro, go ahead.
I want to fill in some gaps because, you know, just to cover the Treaty of Lausanne is a big issue in itself. So I just skirted over it in a general sense rather than going into a more like that. For example, all the comments that were made are very good, and I appreciate your contributions. Now, for example, with the Treaty of Stavridis, Articles 66 to 83 cover the Smyrna provisions, but also one of the articles, please don't ask me the article offhand, actually said that the local inhabitants would have the right of union with Greece if they wanted it through a plebiscite organised through the League of Nations. And also Australia signed the Treaty of Stavridis, by the way. Australia is one of the signatories to that treaty. Now, coming fast forward to the elections of 1920, and of course, when I see monkeys, I hate the damn things because it was a monkey bite that caused the defeat of Asia Minor. And the Australian Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, in the Imperial Conference in 1921 said, so much treasure has been lost and all that over a monkey bite like that. He was pro-Turkish. He didn't really like the Greeks. And of course, the French in particular took a hatred to Greece, not because they didn't like us, because of King Constantine, because of the events of December 1916. And the French elephant never forgot that clash that was known as the Battle of Athens. Now, also too, very quickly, like that, and of course we know the Treaty of Stavridis was never ratified. Coming from an Australian British perspective, just after the fire of Smyrna, we have what's called the Chanak crisis. It nearly brought the British Empire into a new war with Kemalist Turkey. The Turks wanted to pursue whatever remnants of the Greek army into Thrace, but the British took a stand at Çanakkale in the neutral zone that was part of the Treaty of Stavridis, and says, you cross into Europe, that is war. And then Lloyd George sent all these famous cablegrams to the Dominions, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. The Australian and New Zealanders went by the barrel load to enlist to fight Johnny Turk, as is known here in Australia. But then, of course, the British cabinet said, hey, let's step back a minute. And then finally, Harrington, who was the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces in Constantinople, in the end was able to calm the waters and avoided a conflict. Then, of course, it opened the door then for the Mudanya Convention. Now, coming to the Lausanne Conference, like, for example, the Kurds were mentioned. Well, Ismet Pasha referred to them as mountain Turks. That's the term that he referred to them. And of course, the Kurds had a number of revolts during the 1920s and 30s, which were brutally put down. And one of the worst ones was at Dershim, 1937-38. And you also have someone mention about an Armenian homeland. I remember reading in the Near Eastern thing in the British parliamentary paper, not 1 inch of Turkey will be ceded for an Armenian homeland. So said the Turks. And I think Mr. Stavrianidis actually mentioned about Nagorno-Karabakh. Well, we are seeing today over 120,000 Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh have been ethnically cleansed. And I hate that term. I really despise that term, have gone into Armenia. And the question is, if we hark back, say, to 1922-23, when the Greeks left Asia Minor, they could never return. Now, the question is, are the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh who are now in Armenia, will they be allowed? I don't think so. So we have parallels of 1922 with 2023 with the issue of ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh.
I will say that the Kurds were used by the Turks to ethnic cleanse the Armenians in what is now Kurdish territory in Turkey itself. Starting in 1894, by the way. But anyway, I think we have to start wrapping this up. So what I want to do is just have some last comments, thought processes, etc. And I'm going to start again with Stavro. Your thoughts on what we're talking about? And
it really was a great forum. I think it was good to listen to other people hearing what they had to offer, and I learned a few new things. And I think that's the important thing, is the exchange of ideas leads to more ideas, and hopefully what I said very early on is that we need a book that will try to write the history of the Lausanne Conference, like the Paris Conference has been done to death. Maybe it's time that the Lausanne Conference, that a collection of us get together, put our minds together, and work out themes that we can write about like that. I'm actually planning to write an article on the reparations issue through the State Department collections, and maybe also from the British collection as such. That's all I have to say.
Stavro, thank you for that, and I hope obviously we continue this dialogue, because I think we have to come back to it and dive deeper into it. Nikos, some final thoughts for at least today's panel discussion.
Thank you. I just want to raise two minor issues which show why the Anglo-Greek agreement didn't work in the period from Sevres to Lausanne. And a significant reason why the whole thing collapsed for Greece. First of all, the Sevres Treaty was unrealistic, as one of our co-panelists said, for other reasons, not just the military defeat of Greece. First, Greece didn't get the loans that had been promised during the First World War for the war effort. And the British were supposed, according to the treaty, to assist the Greek military effort in Anatolia. Instead of that, in 1920, when the British were involved in a minor civil war between the Kemalists and the pro-Sultan troops in Turkey, they asked for Greek military assistance to settle the affair. So that shows how the whole thing turned around. And why Eastern Thrace was handed to Turkey, it's another issue which was raised, because throughout the negotiations that had been taking place from 1921 to 1922 in the major European capitals, the fate of Eastern Thrace was always connected to the outcome of the Greco-Turkish War in Anatolia. Whoever would win there would take Thrace as well. And in my opinion, that has to do with the fact that Eastern Thrace and the Sanjak of Smyrna being held by Greeks helped the English idea of keeping the Chanak area, the Dardanelles, under British control. So the Greeks were the backup on either side. But if the Greeks failed, as they did in Asia and Anatolia, there was no way they could keep Thrace, because the English would need to have someone else to negotiate with. So I'll keep it there. There are plenty of issues, as you can see, that arise as side issues from this situation, and I wish you had more time.
I will say that, like was stated before, that everybody thinks the major powers take care of themselves. I mean, part of the treaty obviously was they got Cyprus, for example, even though they had promised to Venizelos in the beginning, if they entered the war, that Cyprus would be Hellenic. So there's a lot of things going on. John, some final thoughts and comments.
Sure, I'll try to keep it very brief. I think President Erdogan said that the reason that the Treaty of Lausanne has endured this long is that everybody has some reason to be unhappy about it. So something along those lines. With that, I think it was a very imperfect treaty, but it took a very complex problem, and it tried to make a solution, right? And we are living with the consequences of that treaty to this day. Query as to the merits of it, but today's panel, I think, was really humbling, just to understand how little you know, and how you're always honing in on your knowledge, and the complexity is just overwhelming of these topics. And looking at everyone's contributions from their different perspectives was really inspiring, because it shows that people want to learn from history, to understand the current events, and to try to see if we can move on from here, because the Treaty of Lausanne succeeded in not creating all-out war between Greece and Turkey, but there is a constant tension, and the imminency of war is around every corner. And we've seen a few occasions the last few years that it's made clear that even though there's peace, there can be war that can break out at any moment. So how successful was the treaty in light of that? And that's a rhetorical question. And with that, thanks so much, Lou, for organizing it.
Thank you, John. One of the things that we did not get into, and we'll try to do it in the future in more detail, is boundaries. Okay, national boundaries, national waterways, and all the rest of that. I think that in itself deserves a major discussion, because a lot of the things that are taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean, including the obviously the oil and all the rest of that, become part of this conversation. So we'll try to do that in the future in more details. Thank you, John. Peter, some final thoughts?
Well, the thoughts that come in mind over these years that I've been studying this topic is, first of all, the magnitude of the personality of Venizelos, how his personal charisma, which makes a difference. It makes a difference, in human relations, in business, in diplomatic relations. It makes a difference to have that charisma, but at the same time, to be dikaios, to be fair. I think we can say that Kemal Atatürk was proven to be not only a tremendous military man, but also a tremendous diplomat. Now, that's one. The second thing is, which I mentioned before, is how the Lausanne Treaty is connected, I would say most of the time, directly to all the fronts, the geopolitical fronts that are taking place today, every single one of them, which is amazing. And that gives me a segue to the third one, how crucial, because of the second point, how crucial it is for a student of modern Greek history to know about the Asian Minor catastrophe and the Lausanne Treaty and all those things that we spoke about. And it's unforgivable for an aspiring politician not to master these. And I'm saying master. I'm not saying to know, to master, because I am sure that the Turkish diplomats, especially the ones that conduct foreign policy, do master that and have the ability. When you master something, sometimes you have the ability to find loopholes.
Peter, thank you for that. And I like your comment where you didn't imply this, but I just took it like that. That the Hellenic politicians are lacking in many ways, and in some ways things that are just point blank a certain way,
Right.
they sort of like wiggle around like there's no point blank a certain way, and they're almost like negotiating against themselves. So I
Very true.
agree with you that we are lacking in many ways politically,
Yeah.
whereas the other parties are very interesting and strategic, and also very good at propaganda, by the way. Anyway, guys, you were fantastic. I think this is a topic that we have to dive into a little bit deeper in the future. Certainly, we have to come back to it because there's a lot of issues that relate to this, including the boundary issues that we were talking about. And the other thing, Peter, because you and I and many of us who are sitting here always have everyone yelling and screaming about different things. I'm talking about our community now, and really having no background or knowledge on some of these things that sometimes we talk about. Okay, they don't even know the facts of some of these treaties, and they just make arguments, and just after a while you say, like, what's going on? These people don't know what they're talking about. So, thank you again. We'll come back to this. To the audience, thank you for being with us, and you're the best. Our next panel discussion is a little bit different because we like to do a lot of different things. So our next panel discussion will be in December, and it's going to be on the legacy of the Eastern dance. Now, the Eastern dance is what we call in, let's say, America, maybe some other Western countries, belly dancing. So I'm going to have experts on the Eastern dance because I think this is one art form that's ancient, and it also goes back to, when you go into the museum. I mean, what triggered my mind on this is a statuette in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is called the Veiled Dancer. And that was from 300 BC in Alexandria. And then you see some pottery also from that period. So the Eastern dance is a dance of the Mediterranean. It's a dance that's also Hellenic. And we're going to dive into it with experts who have written books about it in December. Thank you again. And we will talk. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.